Hi, in this presentation we're going to talk about historical perspectives on the field of reading, including reading research and the practice of teaching reading. This presentation will draw strongly on a chapter by Alexander and Fox that is cited here on the cover PowerPoint, so please read that chapter if you get a chance to read it, because that's really where this presentation is drawn strongly from. I'm going to want you to focus in particular, if you're not a PhD student, on what lessons can I draw from the history of the field of reading into knowing where the debates are, where are the different opinions, and why does it feel sometimes as if we're on this pendulum that keeps swinging back and forth, because to call it a pendulum is understating the debates. It's not so much that it's a pendulum and we keep on changing our minds, but it's that people have very, very, very strongly different opinions on the best practices for teaching reading, and at some points in time, some opinions hold power over other opinions. And also, as is the nature with any field of study that involves deep research, sometimes with new evidence that arises in a field come new perspectives and new vantage points. So we'll learn about that as well. Okay, so we're going to start our journey in the 1950s with the era of conditioned learning, which draws on behaviorism. With the 1950s came a concern about the Cold War. Remember, in the 1950s, America saw itself as a rising power after World War II, but we were very concerned about the power of the Soviet Union. I'm sure that hopefully you've studied enough history that you know something about the Cold War, so I don't have to teach that in this presentation. But in 1957, with the launch of Sputnik, came a fear that America was falling behind the Soviet Union in the space race, and with that came also a fear that we, as a nation, were falling behind in our competitiveness, that our students were not as competitive in science and technology and math, the STEM fields and engineering. And so there was a strong concern in that. Where that impacted reading is that there was also a very big concern about the possibility that our children in schools were not sufficient readers, were not showing mastery in readers, as readers. And there were tests that were done in the 1950s that whether they were accurate tests or not, that's a different debate, but there was a series of tests that were done showing that our nation's children were falling behind in reading. And so you had a strong onrush toward behaviorism and toward testing and toward measurable goals for students. If you've studied educational philosophy in one of my other classes that I teach, this is basically social efficiency movement. The idea that you want to make sure in the most efficient way possible that students are gaining measurable skills to be competitive in the economy, and that our nation will, in the most efficient and measurable way possible, be competitive on the global stage. There was a very influential book that was written in 1955, Why Johnny Can't Read and What We Can Do About It, that promoted a phonics-based technique as opposed to whole word-based approaches. Basically, in the field of reading, you have two different ways of looking at reading instruction. One is phonics-based approach, which you can think of as bottom-up approaches to reading. It's from smaller parts of the word on up to the whole word, and you work your way up from small to whole, phonics-based. On the other hand, you also have some who favor the whole word-based approach or whole language-based approach, where you start with the whole word, the meaning, and you work your way down from there. Prior to 1955, and I'm hesitating a little bit because I hate to overgeneralize, but in many schools there was an emphasis on what we might call the look-say approach, the Fun with Dick and Jane readers, if you've heard of them. And these were whole language based approaches, whole word based approaches, meaning first based approaches. And Rudolf Flesch, along with others who thought like Rudolf Flesch, promoted the idea that the Fun with Dick and Jane type books say type of books were promoting bad readers, guest readers, if you will, and that we need to have a very systematic phonics-based approach instead. And so you had a rise in vocabulary readers as well as synthetic phonics, skill and drill type of approaches in this time period. Alphabetic readers that would break it down into individual phonics-based approaches to drawing out words. Skinnerian behaviorism became very popular in the 1950s, promoted the application of principles of analysis to monitoring student behavior the same way that you would regulate animal behavior. If you've ever heard of, for instance, Pavlov's dog, ring a bell at the same time as you're feeding a dog, and you can condition a dog to salivate even if you're not, whenever the dog hears the bell, even if you're not necessarily feeding the dog. You can condition children the same way, according to behaviorists. So there is an advocacy toward processes and skills involved in learning to read that can be clearly defined and broken down into constituent parts. These are practiced and reinforced in an orderly, systematic way, with reading viewed as a conditioned behavior. And teaching as well as research on effective teaching became known as a medical metaphor. You diagnose, you prescribe, you remediate. Behaviorism stresses knowledge as perception and learning as habituated association. Same thing with behavioristic approaches with animals. The act of reading is viewed as a competent and properly sequenced performance of a chain of discrete skills, as in phonics. Repeated pairing of stimulus and response. Practice, 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 in other words. This is linked to the application of carefully chosen rewards and punishments for students. Habituation, habit. The child is presented with symbols such as C-A-T, cat, that are, and then immediately produces the desired word, cat, seemingly without cognitive involvement, its repetition, its skill, its drill. Areas of research within behaviorism and reading include the structuring and control of materials that are helpful in instruction, identification and remediation of problems in skill acquisition for reading, analysis of the appropriate behaviors so that skill training could proceed with stimulation and practice, the study of components of reading processes, reading as a perceptual activity, sight, eye movement. Phonics instruction is seen as a key part of the logical groundwork of beginning to read, and there's a strong emphasis on diagnostic assessments. Reading is seen as a perceptual activity in this approach. You identify visual signals, phonemes, translation of these signals into sounds, phonemic awareness, assembly of these sounds into words, phrases, and sentences. Now, against behaviorism stood pragmatism, William James and John Dewey. You can think of Dewey as kind of an enemy of behaviorism in many ways. So what I'm going to talk about now stands in stark contrast to behaviorism. Now, Dewey was writing long before the 1950s. In fact, some of his most famous works were published in the 19-teens and 20s and 30s, but Dewey's work and the pragmatic approach to reading saw a renaissance, if you will, in the 1960s. kind of juxtaposed against behaviorism. Remember that pendulum that swings back and forth? So within the pragmatic approach to reading, reading is seen not as habituation in terms of control and stimulus and response, but as a mindful, reflective habit. Human thought matters in human action as opposed to human conditioning. Very big difference here. Introspection of the child and as of the teacher matters a great deal. Self-questioning. Why are you doing this? You want to uncover the internal thoughts of the student, not just condition the student. This draws also on Gestalt theory. Gestalt theory is very influential within whole language. And remember, whole language means top to bottom. Whole language stands very much opposed to the phonics first approaches. These are the two schools of thought that tend to be at war with each other. Historically, in the field of reading, they still are. And of course, you also have some schools of thought that kind of try to marry the two as well. For instance, the work of David Pearson tries in many ways to marry whole language with phonics first approaches. In Gestalt theory, whole language, you want to understand the phenomena of words and language as a whole. This focus is on phenomenon as a whole instead of its constituent elements. So in other words, focus on the whole word, not the constituent phoneme and phonics and phonological parts. This influenced Chall, but also you'll see later on that Chall later would disagree with some of Gestalt theory too. We'll study Chall later on. Whole word recognition is very much influential within Gestalt theory. There's a consideration of reading as a unique human activity with definite characteristics. Along with Gestalt theory, in the 1960s and into the 1970s comes an emphasis on natural learning. Natural learning, again, is a reaction against behaviorism. Natural learning stands very much opposed to the behavioristic approaches. So with natural learning, drawing on Maria Montessori, for instance, there is an interest in the internal mental structures and processes sparked by advances in neurology and artificial intelligence, dissatisfaction with behaviorism. So you see information processing theories also at this time. Key trends in the 60s and 70s include the following. The reader is seen as a constructor of meaning. Constructivism, in other words, began to rise, who used many forms of information to rise at comprehension. These forms of communication include language, symbolic elements, cultural cues. There's an emphasis drawing on Clay. Diagnosis focused on understanding how readers arrive at their alternate interpretations in written text. There's a goal of ascertaining how the unexpected responses of readers produce reflection in their attempts at meaning making. So you're trying to get at the reflective thoughts of the reader. This means interview, this means dialogue, this means interaction as opposed to conditioning. Very influential in the 1960s were the first grade studies. This was the first study of their type, done in 1967, in many ways kind of a precursor of the National Reading Panel, which would come almost 25 years later, although there were some differences in terms of these studies too. But the first grade studies obviously focus on first grade, so elementary students and early childhood, brought together researchers from 27 different reading projects to compare various approaches to instruction in beginning reading, early literacy. They investigated the reading process. This was very much interdisciplinary. So from there came very much of a linguistic approach. Those of you that are into second language learning, for instance, or you want to learn more about how to help students who are second language learners become more skilled at learning English, you really need to get further into linguistics, because anyone with, for instance, a PhD that focuses on second language learning would have to study linguistics very deeply. So I'm actually a believer that if you're going to take a course, even at the undergraduate level, that deals with second language learning, you need to integrate some linguistics in there. And certainly at the master's level, if you're going to get a master's that in any way makes the claim of expertise toward English for speakers of other languages or English language learners or any of the various terms we use, then you need to include some linguistic expertise in there as well. And linguistics began to rise increasingly in the 1970s as a discipline. It had been around before then too, but in terms of popularity and research, it began to really become on the rise in the 1970s. There's an assumption made within linguistics that language is hardwired into the brain. And language, there's a common way in which human beings tend to learn language, even if the languages might differ culturally and socially. There's the belief that human beings are biologically programmed to acquire language, so long as the conditions are favorable for this, and that there are certain mental structures inside the brain that help us to learn language. Noam Chomsky. Many of you are probably more familiar with Chomsky for his work on politics, because he tends to have a lot of political opinions. He still is active today. He's very liberal, profoundly liberal, actually. More liberal than me, which is saying something. Hopefully you don't mind a little bit of a joke on that point. But he's also very influential as a linguist. Chomsky developed an approach to what's called generative grammar that focuses on innate mental structures in the brain that help us to learn language. He separated human mental competencies from subsequent performances. And in other words, you have to understand how the brain works in order to understand performance of language. He argued that humans emerge from the womb with a pre-existing template that guides us in the use of language. He called this languaging that unfolds naturally among humans, and it follows a developmental trajectory. It involves action of the environment of the individual, but also it's contributed by genetics. So in other words, we have a genetic predisposition, sorry about that, that is also, of course, influenced by environmental factors. We get into psycholinguistics at about this time. And of course, all of these fields are still emerging, still growing. They didn't go away. Psycholinguistics emphasizes the natural communicative power and inherent aesthetic of reading. Aesthetic means emotion. So psycholinguistics, of course, if you break that down, psycho means, of course, psychology, linguistics, language. So study of language from psychological aspects. Because all human languages follow similar production rules, the capacity for language is built in within people. Focuses on semantics, meaning making, and how meaning is acquired, represented, and used during the process of reading. So you can see why, if you're going to study second language learning, you really need to study psycholinguistics in order to understand how meaning is made across different language systems. We also get into sociolinguistics. This is the study of variations in everyday language and the relationship of those variations to social roles. So what role do we play in society, and how do these roles influence the way that we use language? And how does everyday language get shaped and reshaped in the context of different roles and power systems that are at work within society. So this sociolinguistics contrasts everyday language with academic language. Then we get into the very powerful and influential work of Jean Chall. Jean Chall wrote The Great Debate. It was written and rewritten in 3 different forms, 67, 83, and 1996. This was not just a book, it was basically a very in-depth study that took place in 3 stages in 3 different decades. Chall favored an evidence-oriented approach toward the examination of effective reading methods. When I say evidence, what I really mean is numerical, data-based evidence through a lab type of testing, control type of testing. She believed that research must inform practice. She believed that a code-focused approach, phonics-based, bottom-up, was to be favored in the teaching of beginning reading over what she called a meaning emphasis approach. Remember when earlier I said that whole language and Gestalt theory were influential on Chall? Yes, they were early on, but later, as she became increasingly code-centric, bottom-up centric, phonics centric, she rejected this Gestalt approach. She believed that, to draw on a quote here from The Great Debate, a critical analysis of existing research comparing different approaches to beginning reading. My major concern was with studies investigating method, the how of beginning reading instruction. So she's very much in focus on not what, but how. Not why, but how do teachers teach and how do readers read. She developed what's often called a stage theory model of reading. This explained that learning to read is a developmental process with different skills developed at different stages of development for the child. She contended that models of reading that don't take into account the reading stage of the child when it comes to decoding can't focus on the alphabetic principle itself. In other words, if you ignore the learning stage of the child, then the child is going to become lost when it comes to decoding. Now, contrasting with Chall, we also have information processing theories. This gets into schema theory and so forth. So this is separate from Chall now. Information processing is linked with what we would today call brain-based research, and it became popular in the 1970s and 1980s, and it still very much is around and growing as a field. Research in information processing focuses on the construct of prior knowledge. Language is seen as an interaction between the symbol system and the mind. Alphabet, symbol system, and even symbols that we make in terms of writing and symbols that we encounter in the daily world and how the mind works. Text-based learning was about knowledge, which is organized and stored in an organized way in the individual mind, often through schema, for instance. Knowledge resulted from the input, interpretation, organization, and retention of information. And then, of course, output comes. It's very much focused on strategy instruction and instruction, environments, and pedagogical techniques that contribute to improved comprehension of the text.